Disruption podcast with Janet Hitchen and myself, Mike Klein. Navigating Disruption is a podcast that aims to help leaders and organizations navigate the disruption that lies ahead. Today, in this episode, we speak with Natasha Plowman. Is it Natasha or Natasha?
Depends, I suppose, where your accent is coming from. But
Okay.
being Australian, you've got to go Natasha.
All right. So Natasha is a senior consultant and strategic advisor who helps focus on business reputation challenges. She's been described as the person who will tell you what you need to hear and not simply what you want to hear. An honest, upfront Australian living in the UK, she runs her consultancy Spinning Red, which specializes in corporate comms and public affairs with particular interest in reputation management and a very healthy dose of sustainability, which is a fairly healthy thing after all. She began her career in politics and NGOs and has moved into the corporate and agency world. So she has a really wide understanding of stuff that's going on in our space. She's a huge fan of political podcasts. And I want to welcome you to the podcast, Natasha, and also again to introduce Janet as my co-host for Navigating Disruption going forward. Thank you both for being here today.
Thank you for having me. Looking forward to the conversation.
Yes.
Excellent, excellent. Anything else you want to add to your intro, Natasha?
Look, I think it's I've 25 years meandering around different parts of my career has been quite interesting. And I've written with you before on Weekly Comms around the squiggly career, and I think that's given me a quite good grounding on, where I come from and who I am now, is who you've been. So my career hasn't been, a linear one. And I think that's kind of added value for me, but also the kind of advice I do. So I'm sure bits of it will come up in the conversation of where I've worked and the kind of work I've done. But comms, I'm a real testament to the breadth of comms and comms careers.
Excellent. Janet, do you want to kick off the conversation?
Absolutely. So, Natasha, how do you see the future of the communications profession for the next, I don't know, let's say 2 to 4 years?
Look, the communications profession reflects society, and it needs to reflect society. And I think we've kind of some way lost that way as it become much more the same people speaking to the same issues on the same things, and it's become a real echo chamber. And I'm definitely been part of that echo chamber in lots of ways, where I've been kind of shocked when people don't believe the same things I believe, or people don't have the same views that I have, and you kind of get caught in this kind of spiral of kind of speaking to the same people about the same things. So as society goes through the kind of changes that is going to happen, both from a technology, from a social, from a polarization perspective, the comms industry needs to really look at itself to see, are they reflecting the audiences that they want to influence? Are they reflecting the kind of the general publics of why, and understanding the question of what they're trying to influence and why? And therefore they need to be a lot more move away from data, which is an important foundation, to actually get much more under the skin of the human stories that we're trying to kind of influence as well. And so I think we've kind of gone through a period of adjustment to understand the data and the access to data we've got. But in doing that, I think we've lost the nuance, and I think we've lost the human, and I think we've lost the ability to connect to humans necessarily in the same way, in the multiplicity of what makes up the human experience. And we've become much more talking around kind of numbers than necessarily those human stories we need to do more of.
So I can almost hear the collective intake of breath as people go, she's just said no data.
There's never no data. But data should always be a really important foundation to enable you to kind of unpick and get behind what the data means. It is a really good way. What data does really well is it kind of collectivizes what an issue or what people might view. But what it misses is the outliers. It's the people who don't contribute. It's the people who aren't saying things. And I think, and this is something I've been thinking quite a lot about, and it's there. I'll get to an analogy of what's happening locally in my kind of local area. They want to close the local swimming pool. There's all these people up in arms on Facebook talking about it. There's a survey. The local MP's got involved. Everyone's talking about it. And and then they're not talking to the people who aren't engaged, who aren't involved, who aren't saying anything, who are just who either don't care or are opposed to people wanting to save this swimming pool. And I think when we look at the communications industry, we kind of listen to the people with the loudest voices, and actually it's what people aren't saying. It's when people aren't engaged. It's when people aren't kind of participating in what's being said that we're not listening to enough, and then we get these kind of shocks, democratic elections, because we haven't kind of probed the questions around it. So data is great to kind of give you kind of a baseline, but it doesn't give you the nuance. And I think we need to kind of invest in getting to that nuance as well.
It makes me think about that sort of idea of it, that I can't remember who said it. It's some old adage that somebody very wise said, probably back in the 80s, but that data can tell you whatever you want it to tell you.
Yeah.
So you can cut it, you can retell it, you can slice it and dice it in multiple ways based on the narrative that you've decided needs support, and it needs to fit that, and it needs to really sort of shore that up. And I've seen that happen a lot.
Of course.
Well,
So
it's interesting that both of you are saying that data overrepresents the people who participate, which it obviously does. But also the data may be a weak justification for engaging communication support. And that kind of aligns with my own thinking as well at the moment, which is that, a lot of what we've been using data for is to justify ROI. And your background's reputation management, and we're looking at kind of major geopolitical disruption, which strikes me that a risk-based business justification is probably better for us than an ROI-based business justification anyways. To what extent does that resonate with you, and does that kind of back up your push on this issue?
No, it really does. It's, everything is around kind of balancing risks and trade-offs, and balancing what the opportunity might be with what the impact that would look like as well. And again, data is incredibly important to be able to, put the numbers behind those assertions. But the questions you need to be asking is, who are we trying to impact and why? What is the outcome we're going for with that particular exercise? And how do we measure that we've done that successfully? And that's where you get your data question much more effectively. And I think, looking at business, if you look at business and business reputation, it has to be around, risk, and looking at what is going to be the risk for the markets that you're operating in now and in the future. What is, where, look at resilience of supply chains. That has a whole other kind of risk-based conversation that you need to navigate and communicate and understand and kind of prepare for the future, be it, this we talk about with climate shocks or weather shocks and how they can adapt to that. So I just think from a business communications perspective, we need to be really, really clear on how does your business make money? What are the risks and the trade-offs that need to be made for us to continue to be successful and build that reputation, and move away from, and this is something I move away from business as a force for good. That's something that, I've said many a time, and I've the assertion of it being many a time, that business can be a force for good. They can participate in society. They can fill the gaps where governments may not be. They need to kind of demonstrate that they have a license to operate with how they use their kind of philanthropic or CSR or any kind of other budgets. But I think it's also business needs to get back to what is business there to do, but they also need to do it within the construct of do less harm. And that means do less harm on planet, do have better outcomes for the people and the kind of the operating, but within a business lens and a business risk lens as well. And I think, we need to change the language around that, because I think too many businesses got caught up with fighting to be who could be the worthiest. And what we've seen is a kind of a rejection of that, which I think is, I'm not surprised, I suppose. And it's kind of pitted, businesses against each other rather than what they need to be operating in.
Hello, thanks for tuning in to another episode. If you're enjoying the podcast, we'd love your support in helping us reach more listeners. The best way to do that is hit the subscribe button in your podcast app. It's completely free and means you never miss an episode. And if you found value in today's content, we'd love you to take a second to leave us a rating or a review. Your support really makes a difference in helping others discover this podcast. Plus, it lets us know what resonates with you so we can keep bringing you more of what you care about. Thanks, and take care from me, Janet in London, and Mike in Iceland.
Well, there seems to be a bit of a paradox around that, though. I mean, if you look at the Edelman Trust Barometer,
I was just going to go there.
all right. Do you want to finish my sentence in that case?
No, please go ahead. But I'm glad. I'm like, wow, we're both on Edelman.
Yeah.
Well,
Then we can also have a bit of a trust in data conversation on the back of that, but I'll let you.
no, that's a separate conversation. But I mean, there's kind of two subtexts around the Edelman Trust Barometer. On the one hand, the Edelman Trust Barometer says that increasingly business voices are seen as more credible than political voices or even media voices. But at the same time, I posit that the relative performance of the business voice is not because the business voice is improving that much. It's just that everything else is deteriorating.
Yeah.
And so when you're saying business should talk less about this stuff, are you basically saying that business, um, it's not less important that business actually behave this way than it is for them to stop trying to blow their own horn about it?
Yeah. I think it's definitely around, deeds, not words. What are you doing? What are you delivering? What is the kind of, who are you impacting and how? And it's I agree with you. It's like, trust is fundamental to the society that we want to be able to be moving towards around, but no one knows who to trust, or no one knows, how you balance out those kind of trust, and then you kind of grasp into people who are exactly like you, rather than kind of think about, opposing or different viewpoints. So I think, from a political perspective, it's, everyone's just got into these camps and these tribes and these kind of fixation. And it's like, how does business work across those different tribes and different viewpoints? And that's what we're seeing in the political sphere. So I agree with you. I think what Edelman is saying, it's, on one thing, it's peer. I trust people who are like me and who seem like me. And I don't trust people who don't reflect who I am as a person, and that's self-perpetuating this polarization, which I think is important as well. And the media, the whole conversation around how do you build trust in the media is kind of another one. I mean, it's again, we've seen so many examples of the media highlighting a point of view rather than reporting rational viewpoint, and so that means people don't trust them even more. It's
so
big.
Bringing all of this back to kind of the communications profession, are we positioned well as a communications profession, in your opinion, to navigate this type of disruption that we are assuming is going to start to, hit even more in the coming years? And if we're not, what do you think we need to do in order to get ready?
I think there are pockets, definitely, of people and organisations and functional areas who are positioned well, as long as they have that widest lens. I think good communications and corporate affairs people are generally inherently curious. They kind of read widely, watch widely, listen widely. They ask interesting questions. They're kind of always looking at kind of what if, or looking at the kind of how different things can be perceived. I mean, fundamentally, with a good communicator, it's how will this land to the different audiences we're trying to influence. So I think in that, if we focus on those real human elements of who we are and lose a lot of some of the fixation on justifying our existence and the kind of navel gazing you see around comms as well, then I think we can be really well positioned. But we also need to understand the business that we're supporting understand how they make money, understand how they all the different areas of the communications can influence in a business. And that means connecting all those different dots. I mean, in my career, I think where I've been most effective is when you might sit on a leadership team, not as the comms person, but as kind of, and not even just as the kind of the counsel and the soul of the business, but the person who can connect the dots between different areas of the business that may not necessarily be connected, be it something that may happen in supply chain may kind of come up in a consumer audience, etc. So I think the more communications people who kind of understand that and understand that's their superpower and their skill set, then it will be really effective and impactful. And I don't want to get into debates around where they should sit within an organization, because I think that's just like a non-issue in lots of ways, because it's about your influence and it's about how do you connect dots and how do you connect issues amongst themselves to kind of give that reputational lens. And I also, another thing I think is with comms is the media is just one small part of what you do or what we do. It's, you see all these job adverts and you see all these kind of thinking that the media relations is the most important part of it. And I think that's going to become less and less so. It's much more about owning the story, owning the stakeholder relationships, or understanding how to influence those stakeholder relationships, giving rigor to understanding the stakeholders you're trying to influence and why, and then communicating to an outcome that is beneficial to the business, or an outcome that grows influence with particular stakeholders. The media can be a channel to do that, but I think that's going to become less and less so as the media itself becomes more polarized. And people have got much more opportunity to use their own channels to tell their story. But, and this is the other big but, they need to be open and transparent and honest about what they're saying, because otherwise we get into another situation of, well, they would say that, wouldn't they? And you're not building a kind of proper conversation based on trust. So I think there's, again, quite wide ranging. So I think there's opportunity for comms to do a lot. I think they need to kind of look at the channel strategy and the skill set they use and kind of really understand what makes a good communicator, which is connecting the dots, and then be able to influence the businesses and decision making based on that wide lens that they bring to the table.
Well, it's interesting that you talk about openness and transparency in terms of organizational messages, because one of the trends that I'm anticipating is that they're going to be increasingly conflicting stakeholder expectations, certainly
Yeah.
geographically. The US and the UK are moving in opposite directions. Europe is kind of in play if you look at things on a country by country basis. Um, how do when we're talking about navigating disruption, how do you navigate that disruption when um, you're trying to engage all of your stakeholders who may have major conflicts between them?
Yeah, and we're definitely seeing this in American states, and we've been seeing this for a few years, where how a company talks about how its impact in California, for example, versus how they might talk about their impact in Texas, and then it becomes a blue state, red state issue. And I am no expert on American politics, and although I'm sure everyone has become a kind of quasi expert in the last couple of weeks, I am not going to make that claim at all. And I am. But from a business perspective, there's a real, you're damned if you do, if you're damned if you don't. You're never going to make everyone happy. And I think when I first started my career, and I was working for a big drinks company, there was a real kind of feeling that they wanted everyone to love them. And they wanted, they wouldn't put their head above the parapet because they didn't want to kind of open up conversations they didn't want to kind of have in public, or they didn't want to have, because they wanted everyone just to kind of adore what they're doing. That's kind of some of the issues of reputation. And I think we need to kind of I think businesses are going to have to develop a bit more of a corporate body language of, this is who we are, this is what we do as a business, this is how we make money, this is how we kind of impact society or impact the kind of the operations, and go back to that license to operate conversation, and keep it contained into that, and keep it contained in kind of, yes, D&I is incredibly important because it's about the future workforce and making sure that we have people reflecting the society we're doing. The climate and the planet and climate change is incredibly important because these are the risks to our business, and how do we make sure that we manage those risks and we manage those kind of collective shocks that we're going to get, or we minimize increasing costs in our supply chain because of climate change and weather shocks. So it's bringing it all back, and that polarization, that kind of difference will bring it back to the business and what the business is doing. And I think that's going to be the kind of the role of communicators, to constantly bring it back to people much more effectively, and be able to kind of say, you know, you might have your pet project that you want to talk about, but who cares? Who you're trying to talk to? What's the point? What's the outcome? And just ask all those really important questions of what is the audience wants to hear from you, not just because you want to say it. And I think the last couple of years we've definitely gone through a thing of, you know, competing with kind of who can be the kind of, you know, build up their reputation, and they've been dragged down at the same time, just as quickly. So I think that even keel is going to become much more apparent in the next couple of years, I hope.
So do you think this is about, for communications professionals, is this about understanding what the narrative is? Is this about not washing the narrative, whatever form of washing that might be it green, be it, you know, there's multiple different forms of washing. Is this actually about making sure and reviewing that narrative from all different perspectives, so that it is, as you say, everything comes back to that? Everything has that as its point of reference. Yeah,
I think so. And I think that will then kind of, because then you have to be really clear on your proof points, you have to be really clear on your evidence base. It's much more around, and this is where data becomes really important, because it allows you to have that evidence base, but it doesn't drive the story, because the story is being driven by what you do as a company or as a business as well. And I think, you know, and communications can definitely be that, or that part of a company that asks those tricky questions and asks those kinds of, and kind of asserts that, you know, does anyone actually really care about this? Do we need to be contributing to more noise in the world by communicating this, or can we communicate in a different way? Or can we, you know, what are we developing communication strategy that's a tick box of what you want to say, or are we being really influential in how we communicate and the choices we make? And I think that can be a really interesting part for communications. And it kind of, then it starts merging stakeholder relations and stakeholder management. It starts merging all the different audiences that we need to influence, and gives clarity around what you want from those different audiences more effectively. So it makes it into a much more cohesive communication strategy, rather than a knee-jerk kind of like, we need to comms this. You're kind of questioning, well, why?
Yeah, it's no longer reactive. And I think, as you say, there's almost as if it's sort of any communications professional listening to this, sort of looking at their strategy for next year, looking at what their KPIs are. If their KPIs are the number of articles that you have written, or the number of press releases that you have, or the number of likes, it's like, no to all of that. Not that. It's actually about making sure that you've got the correct narrative, that you've got the right strategy in place, and that you have the right KPIs and measurements available that actually you may not own. They might not be yours, but they are the things that are the right things for the business to measure.
Yeah. I mean, my whole approach to strategy setting is around that strategy informs action, which drives reputation. And what I mean by that is it's absolutely audience first. So it's really, everything you do in your strategy starts with, who is your audience, broken them down, where are they now, what's important to them, what do they want to hear from you, and to what end? So what do you want? And it's the old school. We're going back to the kind of things of, what do you want them to think? What do you want them to feel? What do you want them to do? Yeah. And then from that, because that whole strategic underpinning then informs what tactics, what actions, what you do to then drive reputation, which you will then measure against, you know, if we had a stakeholder who was here, and we want to move them here, or we want to keep them exactly where they are, your reputation KPIs should determine that, and should determine that as an outcome. And anything that can kind of talks around volume measurements or clicks, or, you know, anything that kind of really talks around those kind of driving coverage, you know, doesn't give you a really good focus around what's the impact of what you're doing to that particular audience you're trying to influence. So we need to kind of get away from that kind of that approach.
100%. I was reading, I'm currently reading The Narrative Age by Frank Wolf again, because I've got a book club on it in 2 days. I'm like, let's reread, let's go through. And there was a really interesting stat that jumped out at me, and I thought, well, that's going to be really interesting for our conversation. And it was only MIT did a study, and I can't remember when the study was. It was like 2020, 2021, something like that. MIT study talked to managers, and they said, out of managers, how many of you understand what the business priorities and strategy is? And only 28% knew what it was.
Yeah.
So even if communication professionals only start there so that all of their audience internally know what the business is all about, so that they're then able to influence the customer experience, whatever happens externally, there's 72% kind of up for grabs there that should be easy to get hold of.
Yeah, or have real clarity around the role they play. Mm-hmm. So if a business strategy is shifting product, it's an FMCG company, it's driving kind of goods being sold, and it's the commercial elements of that business. Every single person within that company should have an idea of how they contribute to it. So, supply chain and production and everything, they know exactly they're making the products to get them sold. Sales, we know what they need to do. But what about your finance people? What about your back office people? What about, they all have a massive role to play to make sure that everything's working the way it needs to work. And it's those stories and conversations that should be kind of highlighted in the context of the business strategy. Then you can get people much more engaged and leadership much more engaged behind the internal comms. And then also, internal, and we'll go on to internal comms and external comms, so then become exactly the same thing, because they become that story around who you are as a business, what makes up your business and the people in it. And you're able to talk about, the success you've had or what you're trying to drive through influence, using those people to influence those external stakeholders as well.
Want to explore the burning questions your C-suite and clients are asking? Then you should consider the next Navigating Disruption Mastermind. Janet and I will challenge and coach you in an 8-session program. You'll join other Navigating Disruption listeners and other senior comms pros. For more information, follow the Navigating Disruption page on LinkedIn. No, I understand what you're saying, but I think that requires a bit more inquiry, if you will. Because, what I'm hearing you say is internal comms and external comms are the same. But the reality is that the dynamics of internal comms and external comms are profoundly different in terms of how people engage with each other inside the firewall versus how they engage outside the firewall. And, I get that internal messaging needs to be consistent with external messaging, more so now probably than ever before. But to what extent are we underplaying the extent to which, for example, employees engage with people around the business, the customers, the stakeholders, the political stakeholders, the labor pool, etc.
How we're downplaying it, I think, well, that's how the business runs, and maybe it's the kind of thing. What role does communications play in providing the tools or the assets or the correct narrative for those conversations happening? Of course, salespeople are always talking to customers, and like when we did the thought leadership campaign at HSBC Navigator, the core part of that was to build a kind of insight-led campaign of understanding what was important to customers. And so we kind of did research of kind of a couple of 100,000 people, businesses across the world, and developed content from that. And then it was used by Frontline to help them have a conversation started with customers. So comms and marketing owned the campaign, but the tools and the assets we created were much more useful for Frontline to help them have a conversation starter around what was important to those customers. And that was kind of like a really good example of how did we get, use what we do in comms to influence a business outcome as well. And then be also within that, be able to put the business strategy within that insight as well. So, we talked around sustainability and opportunity of sustainable finance. What was the barrier for businesses to access sustainable finance. And at that time, it was like 80% of businesses didn't know that they could access sustainable finance tools to help them on their transition that they needed to do. And so how do we make that easier for them and then guide that decision? Or you've kind of got other issues that were saying, the big issues they were concerned with as a business was, of course, trade and geopolitics. So what role can a bank play in facilitating those issues as well? And I think it's changed a lot since I left HSBC anyway. But I think, that for me was how does comms use what they do well to be able to influence and kind of give tools to frontline audiences, for example, is quite important.
It's fascinating you say that, because I remember when I was working with Apple Retail, they within the stores, Marcom would put up these beautiful images, and the images would change sort of seasonally. And for a long time, we didn't tell anybody in the stores what any of that meant. Because the dots weren't connected and the relationships didn't exist. And so people would come into the stores and customers would come in and be, oh my gosh, that's so beautiful. What does it mean? And the poor person's going, so they would make it up, or they would say, but they didn't have any, we hadn't supported them with that. And as soon as we understood this was another thing that we could do in order to support the customer experience, but support the employee with the story so that they could support the customer experience, it unlocked something else. It was an extra level that you could go to allow people. So there was pride of understanding the story behind these beautiful images, but actually all of the thinking that had gone behind all of these beautiful images. And that story ultimately would lead to something about a product. It would lead to something about a facet of a product, which would lead to a conversation about the product, which would, could ultimately lead to a sale. And so it created a much greater conversation and a richness of conversation that felt less transactional, but was still ultimately about productivity and revenue.
Yeah.
But in a different way from the transactional, hello, can you have this? Yes, thank you. I will give you my money. Goodbye. Without really understanding what, why, how, any of the other questions. It just was on one level. And so I think as you say, that's really interesting.
And it's that simplicity of clarity around what you were trying to achieve as a business. I mean, ultimately, it all was going towards conversion and making that sale. Mm-hmm. And then you had to kind of look at what is the whole path to purchase? What are the different inputs that you can have within that? And where can communications have an appropriate intervention to support that, or where can they kind of ensure that the reputation of the business is being handled in the right way in those different interventions? And I don't think, I remember when I was at Diageo, that's when we started talking. I mean, I learned around, it's a whole marketing thing around path to purchase and understanding the shopper marketing kind of journey and where the kind of influence is. That's a classic marketing, and comms doesn't speak that language generally. It doesn't speak that language around kind of where they will influence those different actors on that kind of whole journey. And I think that's something we can probably do a lot more of, not to tread on the toes of marketing, not to tread on the toes of sales and everything. It's just to be able to connect those dots and put that lens around where, are there reputational risks? And I think we're going back full circle to the beginning of the conversation around where those risks might be, or where we can use those interventions and opportunity to kind of build reputation with other stakeholders. And it's kind of understanding all of those different areas which enable you to be much more effective and impactful.
It's interesting that you say that, because what you're speaking to is perhaps a more sophisticated and more integrative approach to corporate communication and business communication in general. But certainly one of the things that I'm seeing in the market is kind of a trend towards deprofessionalization of a lot of communication roles. Organizations are spending less money on comms people. They're making the roles more skill oriented and less strategic. How do you reconcile, or what needs to happen to be able to get businesses better engaged with communication so that they can take advantage of the opportunities? And
I think often And I think you're right, and I think it's a real shame, and I find it quite frustrating that we're in that part of the cycle, and this is all cyclical. We've all seen it before, as it kind of where comms plays a role and where corporate affairs, and then we have this whole conversation around how do we name what we do, and then we kind of get this kind of too many different names about talking about the same things. Is it corporate affairs? Is it public affairs? External relations? Is it comms? Whatever it is, they're all part and parcel of the same discipline. And unfortunately, where I kind of worry is that sometimes it's a big, meaty, full-on, awful crisis that is what will get people to kind of start recognizing that comms and effective, influential communications will be adds value to you as a function, but that and be listened to, and that means you need to have your much more strategic communicators. And I think you've spoken before, Mike, around it's not about the seat at the table, it's about kind of, I think it's the hand on the wheel.
Hand on the wheel.
It's your new favorite term, but I think, and I agree, it's where you have the right influence, but you can only have the influence if you know how your business is making money, where those risks might be, how they all connect in together. And so therefore you need to be curious enough to go around the business and build the relationships, ask the right questions. And it's not necessarily, because people won't necessarily connect it. So if you're sitting on a sales or innovation leadership team or something, and they just think you're there to make your PowerPoints pretty, then you're not doing the right job. You should be saying, understanding the whole innovation cycle and recognize where those risks and opportunities might be coming up. And therefore communications can help lessen those risks. And so I think the onus is on us to be curious, to ask the tricky questions, to kind of tell people what they need to hear rather than what they want to hear, and to be able to be more influential. But going back again, if we're not going to have those kinds of people and at the table or doing that job, then it's going to be probably, unfortunately, a big crisis that's going to make people recognise that that's what they need to have to kind of give that foresight.
So actually, if we do have sort of a more a less experienced group of people who are currently in communication, because there's been large numbers of layoffs as we've seen in the last couple of years, is this an opportunity therefore for the people who are in role who might be thinking, I can't have a tricky conversation because I don't feel comfortable? What are the skills that you think actually these are things that you need to practice? And I heard you say, ask the right questions. I would almost sort of phrase it sort of slightly differently. It's just ask all the questions, like all of them.
Every single question imaginable.
But it's that thing of, as you said, if you want that person to understand the business, you've got to understand how X plus Y equals Z. And if you don't understand that, because you haven't asked one of the really, is it a plus or is it a minus or is it a divide? Like, what is that? Or is it Y or is it Y squared? Or is it Y? What is Y? Tell me more about that. If you don't understand that, you can't use your critical thinking. You can't use your ability to be able to analyze that and say, okay, well, what if this happened? Yeah. You're not able to run what if scenarios. Yeah. So are there any other things like that, sort of ask all the questions, get confident at question, like how can people get confident at question asking? How can lots of people say, you need to be more curious. How can you be more curious? Like what advice would you have for sort of more junior or people who are in the first levels of their career?
Yeah. And I think being curious isn't something you learn. I think you can learn, but it's something you notice those things that are happening. You read widely, you ask, you kind of look at different viewpoints and see how they all connect in together. Those are all they should be skill sets which are taught, or kind of, not necessarily skill sets, but they should be things that are celebrated within communications function. So it's how do you, within your team, do you have conversations as part of team meetings that kind of bring to the fore what interesting thing you've seen come across, what video that you've seen or podcast you've heard or article you've read or book you've read or all those kind of things, just to kind of, again, have that kind of within your team, have that a focus on curiosity and bringing new information and new thinking in to it. So that could be one thing as teams can do. It's also if you're in a company that uses agencies, and there's often a big conversation around kind of the role of agencies within in-house companies. How do you use your agency to bring that outside in more effectively? How do you kind of ask those questions of your agency, who then be working with different sectors or different industries or different companies that can give you an idea of what people are talking about, what's important. Stop being so focused on your own sector and your own industry, and start drawing out all the different areas that you can learn and kind of influence as well. And look, I'm not one. I mean, I'm not what, get out and network. I say it, I don't do it. I hate it. You love it. It's fine. I love my house. I'll join a webinar and all that kind of stuff, and I'll read and all that kind of stuff. But actually getting me out in an evening, particularly in the middle of winter, is almost impossible. But sorry, Mike, but I think that they're all the things that can be really important, that outside in. And just as the one thing, when people get so focused in businesses and you get, and I worked in house for a very long time, and you get very tunnel vision within your company or within your industry or within your sector. That is the one fundamental thing that you need to not do as a communicator, because there is so much going out in kind of different sectors and industries and different ways of operating that you can learn, adapt, and things. And this is from the recruitment that we're seeing at the moment, that we're now hunkering down into industry and sector specific experience, which I think is incredibly dangerous, because I think comms inherently should bring new thinking and new ideas and a new perspective. And I think we need to kind of celebrate that as well.
Well, let me flip the question then. Because we're talking about what do you do if you're on the inside? What do you do if you're on the outside? We've got a lot of really talented senior people out on the market at the moment.
Yeah.
And certainly I see, when you were talking about, it's going to take a big crisis to get organizations to wake up for it. I think we're in that crisis, or at least we need to anticipate that some form of that crisis will be hitting organizations in a very personal way fairly quickly. How would you advise people who are on the outside in to, for lack of a better term, seize the opportunity in this situation?
Yeah, I mean, the market at the moment is just nuts, and particularly in the UK, and I think it's kind of reflective of different parts from other groups I'm in at the moment, and particularly kind of the more senior end. And I don't quite understand it as well, because I think with seniority, it brings you perspective, a calmness, and ability to connect those dots much more widely. And you might want different things of work. So, and I think for people, and you're seeing it a lot, I mean, where people are kind of positing a view or giving an analysis, or, they're showing how what may happen in one sector may influence another sector as well. And I think these are the things that they should do more of. And I mean, and I do think, I mean, I love a bit of LinkedIn. We're kind of, and I use it a lot, and probably too much. It's kind of my little platform of kind of pontificating.
That's how you network.
But it is, but it is an echo chamber, and it is a kind of, sometimes you're speaking into a void, and it's the kind of the one-on-one relationships. I mean, like, it's, I've met you both through kind of LinkedIn and having those conversations and shared views. What we don't do enough of, and I think people who are outside in can kind of really start looking at what the counter view might be, what different perspectives can be brought in to it, so we kind of move away from the echo chamber. And when you aren't aligned to a business and you're not kind of in that tunnel vision with a company, you can have that clarity of seeing all different perspectives and views. And so all those senior people in the market at the moment can, how can they then bring that to the fore with people who might be kind of just getting really fixated on the company that they're working in directly at that point in time.
So really what you're saying is, this is a great time to be contrarian, this is a great time to be visible, and it's a great time to be vocal. Is that basically what you're saying?
I think so, because, and I mean, not necessarily contrary, but kind of just offering different perspectives and viewpoints, and offering, and not to be, not to be not to kind of incite division and debate and conflict, but to kind of, to allow you to have more of a voice that you might feel constrained from having when you necessarily are employed. And I think people should be able to do that a lot more. And and it doesn't have to be a platform like LinkedIn. It could be, those different groups and networks that you have and do, and offer your support and offer your advice. I personally love being asked for advice, or like being asked for kind of a viewpoint on something, and and then being able to and then and that builds those relationships. So there's some other work I do. I'm on an organization where it's called Open Door for climate people, and so I've had a couple of conversations with people through Open Door who are kind of wanting to work in climate or wanting to work in sustainability, and you spend half an hour of your time just having a conversation around what you did, what you didn't do, how it worked, and how that can then be translated. Use your time to do that, because people like to give something as well, and I think there's a real opportunity to do more of that when you're not working and not feel ashamed by that. And also ask people like me for 30 minutes of time if you want to have a conversation about something, and more than likely I will try and do that, because I think it's kind of you're paying it forward to kind of different sectors and industries as well.
Well, it's also great when you have a conversation with somebody and you're learning as much as you're giving.
Always.
It's always 50-50.
Yeah, no, it always is. And it's that kind of, again, goes back again to that curiosity and being that kind of open to kind of new thinking and new ideas. I mean, you never stop learning, and anyone who thinks they know it all, run a mile, because no one does. And, we're always learning, and kind of, every new platform, every new idea, every new kind of thing adapts and changes. And, for me, I'm loving this time of my life in particular, where you're kind of recognizing where you've been and like in the last 25 years, but then there's so much more to do.
Yeah.
And, and like, it's that kind of that midlife career of kind of building and growing and developing, which I think is quite good. And it's kind of a wave. I think there's going to be a lot more people getting on, as well as they, lose some of the things they may have done in the past and kind of look to the future.
We talked quite early on in our discussion about internal and external, and then we went, oh no, we're gonna back away from that because we're going to talk about it later. Now is later. So we're looking at, the blurring of lines. We've kind of talked about that, the importance of the increasing importance, because it's always been important, even if it just has never been set up in that way. Was it ever thus? Is this now a new thing? Is there a new level that we need to get to? Where do you see that kind of going in the next couple of years? We've got lots of recruiters who are starting to say, oh, actually, we need external and internal. And we're seeing a lot of external being kind of almost put above internal as sort of, that's the senior partner, and internal's the junior part. Like, talk to me a little bit about that, and where do you see that, and where do you see the sort of that landing in the next couple of years?
Yeah, I never quite understood why internal comms was always seen as the junior partner.
No, I don't get it.
And I never, or the tiers of communications of kind of like, your media relations person and your public affairs person, which, historically tends to be a lot of men as well, particularly in the public affairs space. I mean, that's hopefully changing a lot more. And I think there's a gender divide between internal and external comms as well.
Okay.
But that we won't go down that track. I'll just kind of like let that to come up in the comments at some point. But, at the end, I mean, I think with the advent in the last couple of years, particularly around social media, is that anything external can become external. Alison Taylor talked quite a lot about in her book Higher Ground around whistleblowing. And leaking is the new whistleblowing. And I remember I did a post about that a while ago, and I thought it was really, and it's true. I mean, you've heard that one before, haven't you, Hammer?
Well,
Mike,
I
read the
wrote
book,
an article.
Mike.
Sorry about that. I wrote an article about that here in Iceland. I'm based in Iceland.
Yeah.
And the saying was, if you want somebody to pay attention internally, put it in the newspaper. If you want to get somebody to pay attention externally, send an internal memo and have it get leaked. That's actively how they manage comms here.
Yeah, and I think it's true, and I think it's kind of like, whereas people will trust what was in the news. Internal audiences would trust what was put in the newspapers, was put on LinkedIn, was put on these external channels more than they necessarily trust the newsletters. They also wouldn't read the newsletters internally. I mean, let's be clear. They're more likely to things that they can share that are kind of more public to kind of take more sense of. So that blurring of internal, external, and the channels you use are incredibly important. So I think that skill set needs to be blended. I think it's comms, full stop. And it's comms in that, going back to what we're talking about around, what are who and what are the audiences you're trying to influence should determine the channels you use rather than the audience itself. So you don't just kind of say, we'll only talk to internal employees through these kind of curated types of channels that we've got, and we'll only talk to stakeholders through these kind of channels. And they're actually a lot more kind of nuanced and blurred. And to your point, that if you want something to kind of be upweighted internally, then kind of put it into the newspapers so that people will read. So, and I think, but it all comes back to the same strategic approach, which is, who is the audience, understand where they are now, and understand where you want them to be. Full stop. And regardless if that's internal or external or any other type of audience, it's fundamental to always start from that premise. And only then do you start dividing up the tactical and the actions that you're going to do. So in the center should always be that kind of strategy the kind of strategic comm starts in the middle. But I also, but I think the whole, with the advent of social media in particular, and that's where it's become so much more highlighted, because nothing is internal only. And it never will be, and it won't be, and it never was. Were people really monitoring what people said in the pub conversation, or when they were kind of out and about, or what they're kind of talking about on the street? No one ever knew that. It's just now we've got more evidence of kind of things being leaked because of social media, but it was probably always thus anyway.
I think it's really interesting. I was talking to a chief communication officer a couple of weeks ago at the fellowship lunch of the IOIC, and she said they brought in somebody from internal comms to talk about some work that they'd been doing around audience internally and a campaign, and it was very kind of, the way it was done was almost a very scientific approach. Here's what we've done, here's how we've studied, here's who we are, what we understand. But actually the tools that they were using were much less than the media tools and the media monitoring tools and all that kind of good stuff that external had. And at the end, as the person, quite sort of, maybe probably kind of 5 to 10 years within communications, sort of sat down, apparently some of the external communications team kind of went, wow, we had no idea that you did all of that. We thought you just put a newsletter out.
Yeah. And I mean, one of my greatest frustrations when I kind of would do anything internally was we couldn't segment the internal audience. It was just like internal audience, and they were just, and that's just who they were. It was, you might do a little bit of kind of like who was frontline or who's field based, and you might do kind of within the kind of the functional area and communicate specifically there. But then when you're a corporate communications and you're kind of in the center, it was just like this internal audience, and that goes against everything from a strategic point of view about what do you want them to do differently.
Yeah.
And how do you want them to act differently? Then you need to segment your audience. And it was kind of always a very big bugbear of mine and kind of one particular big company, that it was just impossible. The internal data of who
it's the
people
HR
were,
data.
The HR data was woeful. And so therefore you couldn't segment in any way, any kind of, meaningful way.
Yeah.
And so therefore therefore you go back into just creating more noise, which people isn't targeted, isn't effective or impactful, and doesn't actually have that think, feel, do outcome that you're looking for from whatever you're communicating.
Or you have that, but actually you can't really achieve it, so you're just sort of fudging it a lot of the time in order to be able to get there. Yeah, I think HR data has been the bane of my life and I worked in HR before I worked in internal comms, so I'm allowed to say that because I was an HR person beforehand, and it was a bugbear of our lives then, because it was a bugbear of everyone in HR's life.
Yeah,
there has to be something done in order to allow that data to be usable and to allow you to, as you say, to segment, to target, to not create noise where noise is not required, or where noise will create confusion.
Yeah.
And therefore mean that people just switch off because they think, oh, it's another one of those messages. The last 3 weren't for me, so this one won't be, even though that's probably the most important message that they need to receive.
Yeah.
Well, a lot of that's willful too. Like a lot of organizations just don't want to go there when it comes to things like really deeply segmenting their employee population. They don't want to circulate the data, or they don't want to even collect it because they're scared of tripping some kind of imaginary political, legal, or regulatory wire. Um, and I guess the issue for me is, the extent to which we demand that we get access to this data versus accepting the data that we're given to a certain extent.
And also, what are we segmenting by? We're not. It's, and I think, and it might be just more of a, how do we allow people to self-select their engagement in a different way, or rather than kind of contribute to the noise, be a lot more targeted around what people want to hear from you, and therefore you provide platforms that are available and accessible rather than this constant push. And I think that's where we can probably be a lot more advanced in how we communicate internally and externally and have those blurred lines, because then people can automatically self-select a lot more. Now, at the same time, then we have to be really clear, and this is where I've kind of commented problems before. You be really clear about what's an absolutely important message, but then the comms person needs to be asking that kind of question: is this a really important comms message, and why? Because it used to always be results, the most important comms message that we can do, and we did this whole orchestration around results. And the reality of it is, for most people, it probably wasn't. I mean, the only thing they were interested in, if they had shares, what the implications with that would be. But all the other nuanced kind of bits around it were, generally for the population. That's something they could pull rather than be pushed to.
Which again, as you say, comes back to that idea of, oh my goodness, which comes back to that idea of understanding your audience and understanding what's important for them and working for your audience as opposed to working for the business partner. For the business partner, who was probably somebody in finance or the CFO, that was indeed the be all and end all of their week, their quarter, and for them it was their hallelujah moment. Great, that's your wow moment. You've got your wow moment. You've got it. But does everybody actually need to have that information? Who really needs to have that information? How does that need to be translated? So, yeah.
Well, I mean, there's a huge governance issue here too, which is who gets to decide what all employees listen to and what all employees receive. Whether that's HR, whether that's the comms leader, whether it's the internal comms person or whatever. A lot of organizations just don't have that governance and let people, basically leave it to God to sort it out.
Yeah. And without opening up another can of worms on that one, that whole discussion, and this is for another discussion at some point, or kind of who decides what's important. And we're seeing this externally as well. And we're seeing this everywhere. And my big worry we're going in the moment is the editing that people have decided what you should be told and what you should know, and kind of silencing differences of opinion and silencing dissent, and kind of that whole moral panic we're getting in different areas. And I think how business gets caught up in that is going to be another interesting one that's going to come up as well, as we're kind of seeing more widely in society. Because I'm really, one thing I'm most worried about with kind of the advent of polarization is that so many groups of people is going to be silenced, and maybe it's become more libertarian as I've gotten older. And I think that's part of the problem we've got, is that people aren't being able to kind of have conversations and have conflict and dissent, but do it in a way on the issue rather than the person. I'm going to cough again. Excuse me.
Which kind of brings us to that whole concept of, are we helping people to understand how to disagree agreeably? Are we helping people understand how to debate?
Yeah.
And as you say, take the person out of it and be able to have a healthy conversation that explores a subject through curiosity, and goes in with an open mind and asks questions. I actually did that a couple of years ago. I was on holiday, and someone was on the table next to me was espousing how wonderful Elon Musk was. Marvelous, wonderful, fantastic. And he was so loud, and I turned and he wanted the whole pub to hear. So I asked a question, and he kind of was shocked. And I said, no, I'm really curious. and he was incapable of, everything was just one level, and I had to agree with him. And he was incapable of having a conversation and a debate. He was capable of telling me what he thought in one go, but he wasn't capable of then having that explored, dissected, another perspective looked at it, reframed. And I think there's huge opportunity there, possibly for us as a profession, but not immediately, but to help people understand how to frame things, how to ask questions, how to listen, so that you can ask follow-up questions, as opposed to just splurge out what you think and actually then put the barrier down.
Yeah. And also multiple things can be true at the same time. And
cognitive dissonance.
And it's just because you might come at things from a different perspective doesn't mean what other person's saying is wrong. And, and it's also, how your viewpoint impacts other people. And that's when it comes back to business. It's like being really clear around what your impact is, what the trade-offs you're making, and how you can communicate that more effectively. Because it's almost like it's this whole fixation on the win-win. It's the fixation on everyone's got to win something, and it just doesn't work like that. But we need to be honest about it, rather than kind of try and fudge what may or may not be true for different audiences and people.
I want to ask kind of a last point just on the subject of honesty, given that you mentioned that. What do you see as the prognosis for honest communication in organizations going forward over the next, say, 6 months to a year?
What a question.
Yeah, it's what I'd like to see is much more honest communications around what the implications are and trade-offs. And I'm kind of becoming quite a broken record on a lot of the things I've been thinking about around trade-offs, because I think that's incredibly important. I loved the thing, what Keir Starmer started talking about when he did his election speech. And I want to see more of this in politics as well, but I want to see more of it from business. So if you want this, then these are some of the implications. If you want this to happen, if you want, cheaper energy, then other people you're going to have to look at the energy system in a different way. If you want to have, cheaper housing, then you're going to have kind of other people here. And I think from a business perspective is if you want lower prices on things, then these are some of the implications that are going to happen. I'd like to see more of that communication. I think in some pockets we will start seeing a bit of it. I think it's going to be quite a while. I think everyone is still very raw into either, the Armageddon of the world, which, when you go in sustainability circles is quite high, versus the other people saying there's going to be some silver bullet that's going to happen at some point. And there's a whole lot in the middle that no one's really talking about. It's around the poles as well. So from a business perspective, I'd love to see more kind of like we didn't get this right. And we've seen a couple of examples, be it Lego, be it Unilever, who have said we haven't been able to get this right. And it's been really welcomed. And you've got other organisations who have said we haven't got it right and everyone's just torn them down. And that's kind of, from a communications perspective, I think is a real shame, rather than kind of being able to have an honest conversation and debate. I know that answers your question, but it's kind of something that's front of mind for me at the moment, is that I think us in the progressive side, me in the progressive side of things, and you see a lot of people who are my peers, they're more focused on dragging people down rather than kind of like looking at, well, what are the implications and trade-offs that businesses are making that they need to make.
Do you think, just to kind of as a last question on that, Unilever, because there's been sort of mixed response to Unilever, Lego, same thing, but do you think it's more about the fact that actually they're still making a profit?
Yeah.
Do you think profit trumps everything?
When you're in business, yes, it does.
Yeah.
And then we shouldn't shy away from that.
Yeah.
I mean, we should, but this is where it's kind of, you come back to kind of, and then look at what is your impact on planet, what is your impact on people, and have like a better conversation around that, rather than kind of just being a force for good. We cannot shy away from the fact that business is there to make a profit.
Yeah.
We have to look at the license to operate as well. And I think that's kind of an area that's coming back into more conversation around it. But it's not something that should be kind of like a dirty dark secret.
And communication professionals can really help with the narrative and the framing of that narrative in order to help employees and customers and other external stakeholders understand all of that.
Yeah.
Is there anything else either of you would like to add? I think Janet and I might want to have a quick chat after we're done here.
Yep. Nothing for me. I mean, thank you very much for having me. We kind of touched on so many different areas that I'm wondering how it's all going to kind of flow and kind of come in together. But I think the more we have these kind of honest conversations around disruption and doing things differently and thinking things differently, and maybe also bringing back some of the older, calmer brains into your business to allow those strategic conversations to be had more effectively, it can only be a good thing for business more broadly.
But what kind of better way to navigate disruption than to bring in more calming influences?
Absolutely. We've seen it before as well. I mean, that's what we forget, none of this is new.
No. As you say, it's just a cycle, and it's just what that cycle looks like. And we know that cycle hasn't been as deep this time, but it's been longer this time. And so, it's just waiting for that, hopefully, to tick up. So, Mike, Navigating Disruption podcast number 1 is in the can. Brilliant conversation with Natasha that we had yesterday. Obviously, that was yesterday. I'm now wearing different headgear, so I'm just going away and put a cap on. Sure. We haven't just done a quick outfit change. What did you think? How was that for you?
Well, I think it was a conversation that really touched a lot of different bases. Looking at first of all the current situation from a PR perspective, and I mean by current situation where communication professionals see themselves in the time of change that we're dealing with at the moment. There was also a really useful conversation about how internal and external comms do work together, should work together. So, certainly Natasha and I had some different views on that subject. And at the same time, it was quite actionable. She was offering some very specific suggestions for people to follow to make themselves more central to some of the conversations that are taking place. What was your take on it?
Well, I think if we look at what we've said, the purpose of the Navigating Disruption podcast is, and I've got it written up on the screen, so I am going to read it because I don't know it off by heart. We've talked about unique insights, and I think we don't hear a lot from Natasha. And I think we should hear more from her because I think she's got a really unique perspective. 25 years in the industry, and she's kind of been across politics, NGOs, corporates, different types of corporates, agency side. So she's seen all different angles and perspectives, which allow her to have kind of really interesting insights that she brings. I love the fact that she gives specific insights as well, so it's not kind of broad brush stuff. She's actually got really actionable stuff that she's done with specific organizations that she's worked at. So I think that's always really, really helpful, because a lot of people are like, yeah, you say that stuff, but how do you do it? And she's got some real how behind the why and the what, which is always great. We also sort of said we wanted people who are expressive. She's very expressive. She's not afraid to kind of get stuck in, have a conversation. And I really love that, because I think one of those things that you can sometimes get with is it feels like an interview. So it's somebody asks a question, somebody answers a question, and it feels a little bit like playing tennis. And this felt more, it felt better than tennis. It felt less kind of batting backwards and forwards. It felt like a conversation. And I think that's one of the things that you and I had kind of talked about. And we also said that we want a podcast that's engaging, empowering, and actionable. And I think she was very actionable in some of the stuff that she said. I thought she was very empowering. And here's what we can do. And you don't need to go and study an MBA in order to be able to be curious. Those kinds of things.
I think that was key, because really a lot of what a lot of the challenges we counsel are facing right now is how do we get to be influential quickly in an environment like this? And I think Natasha's advice is very timely.
Yeah. So I think if we look back at the purpose of our podcast and like what we've done with Natasha, I think it's tick, 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 tick. I think it was a great conversation. And I hope people take her up on that, the offer that she gave of, if you want to reach out and have a chat, then please reach out and let's have a conversation. I think that was, there is nothing better than the communications community for supporting each other. And I think that was, that's really quite brilliant. So yeah, big tick from me.
Big tick for me too. Thank you very much. And on to the next episode.
Absolutely.